Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of About Abortion. I'm Beth Davey, and today I am joined by Dave. Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on your podcast. It's an honour to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. It's great to have you finally.
I've been a great fan of your podcast for a long time, actually.
Oh, good. So, yeah. Well, I have heard that you do look quite similar to one of our regular hosts.
Yeah, I've been out there. Yeah.
Well, today we're kind of doing our Easter episode. And so I was wondering, before we start, do you have any memories of Easter growing up as a child that particularly stand out to you when you think of Easter?
Easter, I mean, I'm from a Baptist tradition, so we tend to have quite a light touch approach to the festivals, I would say. So we certainly celebrated it, but yeah, we never went too heavy on all the trimmings. But yeah, a good bit of lamb. I used to go to Wales pretty much every week Easter growing up, so a good bit of Welsh lamb was often a feature.
Sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
We had one Easter where my grandmother from America came over and she did not like lamb. And every time we went out to someone's house for lunch, they presented us with some extra special Easter lamb. And I think in the space of 3 days, she had 4 lamb meals, which was not to her liking.
Did it set her straight, or it didn't?
No, it put her off lamb completely for the rest of her life.
You can overdo lamb, can't you?
Yes, yeah. So today we're going to be, as I said, talking about the Easter story. We read ourselves into Bible passages quite a lot, don't we? Can you explain a bit about how we rightly read ourselves in, but maybe how we should readjust our reading of the Easter story to maybe consider it in ways that we haven't read ourselves in?
Yeah, I think it's quite natural for us to read ourselves into stories. We hear a story, we imagine ourselves as one of the characters. There are, of course, dangers with that. We naturally want to read ourselves in a positive light, perhaps. So if there's a hero of the story, we're inclined to think, well, that's me.
Classic David and Goliath, we're always David.
That's right, yeah. Never the giants.
No.
But praise God and his people. So that's just something to be aware of. But and I think some also have objected. I think there's an emphasis out there at the moment amongst many evangelical churches that's really quite hostile to seeing yourself in the story at all. You know, so there's a quite famous clip from Tim Keller, which is going through stories of the Old Testament at pace and saying, you know, it's not about you. You're not David. And of course, that's true. It's about Jesus ultimately. And yet we do also see in the scriptures that, for example, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, these things happened to them as examples and were written down to us, down as warnings for us. And so we're constantly being told, don't be like Israel, or, you know, Elijah was just a man like us, and he prayed. And so there is a valid way that we read ourselves in. We have to do it carefully, prayerfully. But I think especially when it comes to the great gospel story of Jesus' birth, death and resurrection, of course, this time of year we're thinking about his death and his resurrection. Of course, first and foremost, these stories are indicative rather than imperative. So they are telling us what happened on our behalf. Christ died for sins. But I think in evangelical circles, we are less familiar with how we also meant to see ourselves in the story. Examples, warnings, encouragements, and so on. And I think that applies certainly to the text we're looking at today.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So you quite rightly pointed out before this podcast started that we quite often like to think of ourselves as Barabbas, which, to be honest, I'd never thought of it from that perspective. I always saw myself in the crowd because it's that hymn that we sing, isn't it? Ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. So I always pictured myself in the crowd being one of the people shouting, crucify him. You highlighted that we like to see ourselves as Barabbas being the one set free so that Christ could die on our behalf. But today we're wanting to suggest a different reading. Where in the story might we be going and seeing ourselves today?
Well, yeah, we want to look at the character Pontius Pilate, who is, in some ways, you know, as you read the text, he's just one of many characters wheeled in for a short time. He's not particularly anti-Jesus. He's not particularly against the Jews or their religion, or he's not an especially blasphemous guy, and yet he's gone down in history, hasn't he, with quite a record. I think you were mentioning the historic creeds.
Yes.
Now, off the top of my head, I can't think of any other human being who gets a mention apart from Jesus in the creeds. Is that correct?
Yes.
So
Mary.
And Mary. Okay,
And
correct. Mary. Yeah, Mary. So if you're not Mary and you're not Pontius Pilate,
Yeah.
you don't feature in the executive summary of the Christian faith. So that's quite a big deal.
Yes.
Although he's almost, well, he always comes across passive, doesn't he, in the text?
Yes, he does. And it seems he makes, as we'll be discussing later, he makes quite an effort to remove himself from the guilt. And yet, as you said, in those creeds, he is remembered as the one being primarily responsible, really, isn't he?
Should we quickly recap the story for those?
Yeah, I think that would be good.
So we're not going to read the whole text. We've got this in we're going to be mostly, I think, in John, but also Matthew, different accounts of the same event. And of course, in a nutshell, what happens is the Judas betrays Jesus. The Jews go and arrest Jesus, and he's got a kind of double trial going on, hasn't he? Because he's tried in a kind of Jewish court by the high priest and so on, but they don't have the legal authority to put him to death. And so they bring him, don't they, to Pontius Pilate. And right from the off, I think it's fair to say Pilate's not wanting to get involved.
Yes.
He's trying to say, look, this is a Jewish issue, you deal with it. But they keep putting it back in his court because they can't execute someone. So we kind of come in at the story in particular John 18 and John 19, and what we see is this really quite this sort of inexorable surge towards the crucifixion, that in a sense it looks like Pilate's actually trying to stop that, but actually he ends up being instrumental in it.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I would say that's fair. And like you said, we don't really know much about Pilate apart from this scenario. So he kind of comes in just at this stage in the story, and then afterwards we don't see very much of him. But it seems to me that he's trying to play both sides almost, isn't he? He's trying to keep the Romans happy. He's trying to keep the Jewish people happy. And then in a way his attempt to remain neutral means that ultimately he is culpable. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Summary.
I think that's right, and that's why I think we're looking at him today in terms of the question: am I actually a pro-choice Pontius Pilate? Because yes, fundamentally the story is about what Jesus has done on our behalf, but there's also there are also ethical, moral, behavioural examples and warnings for us here. And actually, how we treat Jesus is the most important question there is. You know, we're going to be all of us facing judgment one day, and really the fundamental question will be, what did you do with Jesus? And Pilate's response to that is going to be terrifying for him, because it's right here. But one of the ways I think in which we need to read ourselves into this story is Jesus says, for example, Matthew 25, but also elsewhere, that how we treat others, in particular how we treat the vulnerable, how we treat his followers who are persecuted, that is how we treat him. So actually, how we treat, for example, the unborn child in our culture, them being the most persecuted, the most oppressed, the most vulnerable people group on the planet, certainly within our culture, how we treat them is not incidental to our Christianity. It's not just an add-on, a bolt-on, nor is it a kind of secondary issue, optional. Well, you know, some people are into recycling and others are into protecting babies from violence. It's actually crucial to how we treat Jesus.
Yes.
So I think it's very pertinent to us as we reflect on Easter, yes, what Jesus has done for us, but also what are we doing with Jesus? And actually, I think Pilate gives a remarkably clear reflection of how so many of us, including those who call ourselves pro-life, including people within the church who would never themselves commit abortion, I think he serves as a really uncomfortably close image in terms of how we respond to this injustice.
Yeah. And I think it would be really good to maybe highlight some of his actions through this narrative and draw out those parallels a bit stronger, because it's very easy for us to say we can be like Pilate. Other people may just say, no, we're not. So let's dive into actually how we are like Pilate. So the first thing that I wanted to draw on, I think, is in the passage in Matthew and in John where Pilate sits in the judge's seat. And then in Matthew, it goes on to say that Pilate's wife sends him a message saying, don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. So Pilate's in that judge's seat, his wife is warning him, and yet Pilate disregards that warning. How are we like Pilate in this scenario?
Yeah, I think it's interesting and significant the way Pilate was sitting in the judge's seat, because he wants to say, this has nothing to do with me, this is your issue, and just looking back, he's doing the whole, who shall I release, Barabbas or Jesus? He's trying to find a way out, and in that sense, he's not against Jesus, and yet he sits down in the judge's seat. I think for me that something that shows is the sort of the inevitability of taking a side. We might fool ourselves, we can be neutral. We might think that we can be neutral, might want to be neutral, but you can't. Each one of us sits in the judge's seat. I like the way Aisling, in her presentation on how to end abortion, the way she says, we can only play one of four roles in an injustice: victim, perpetrator, bystander, or defender. And it's that bystander, I think, that's what Pilate would be. He wants to be a bystander, but the reality is bystanders are complicit. They perpetuate injustice. In his case, in a very extreme way, he literally has the authority to hand him over to be crucified, and that's what he does. But I think there's something about sitting down in the judge's seat that we all need to acknowledge, that we all sit in the judge's seat. We all either are defending the unborn, or we're contributing, if only by silence, to their oppression. And I think that's where the church and so many others in our nation will say, well, I'd never have an abortion. If I got pregnant, I wouldn't have an abortion. It's not something I would do. But, ultimately it's got to be up to the woman to choose, and they will accuse us of being judgmental. Who are you to judge what a woman should do with her own body or whatever, as if they're not judging, but they are. They're judging the unborn as unworthy of life.
Yeah, and it's like Jesus said, isn't it? Whoever isn't for me is against me. So there's no then neutral zone where you're not against him, but you're not technically for him. If you're not judging for him, you are judging against him.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting parallel as well. I just watched the documentary, A Letter to the American Church, and something that Eric Metaxas highlights is that in Nazi Germany, I think there were 18,000 pastors, only 3,000 withstood Hitler, only 3,000 stood with Hitler, and it was the remaining, 12,000 then, who were silent and allowed the genocide to take place on their watch. And so there really does seem to be this neutrality isn't neutral, but is really culpable, responsible, sinful.
Yeah, it's lethal, isn't it? And it's that cowardice that keeps people in the so-called neutral. But it is lethal. It's, Hitler only rose to power because people allowed him to.
Yes.
And they delayed and they wished that it was different, or they fooled themselves he wasn't that bad until it was too late. But it's so often the way, isn't it? Every injustice prospers on the back of bystanders.
So we've got him sat in the judge's seat. The next thing I want to do is him ignoring his conscience. As I said, his wife sends him this message don't have anything to do with this innocent man. He knows that he's innocent. He says to the crowd, I find no wrong with him. And yet he still hands Jesus over to his fate. So what's so detrimental about going against our conscience?
That's a great question. I think the conscience is such a delicate thing. God has given all of us a conscience. His law is written on our hearts. It's true of pagans, of unbelievers, of unregenerate. But I think it is possible to, of course, go against your conscience. It is it's almost like a form of the law. It's a universal version of the law. It's less specific, of course. It's not flawless. But it is a gift from God, and it's something that we need to use. But I do think it's possible to dull the conscience. We read in Scripture, don't we, of consciences seared.
Yes.
And having lost all sensitivity, they hand themselves over to sensuality. And I think there is, going against your conscience, it's almost an act of spiritual and moral self-harm, because it makes it harder next time. And I think once you start making excuses, going against your conscience, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling habit, I think. And so there's a real opportunity here for Pilate, not only his conscience, but his wife, affirming the truth that he recognised, this man's innocent, and yet he goes against that. And that means, he's without excuse. And again, in Romans 1, it talks about us being without excuse, because God has made himself clear through nature, natural revelation, and also our conscience, bearing witness at a kind of moral level.
It is almost like, going back to Pharaoh, isn't it? He hardened his own heart to what was right and wrong, and as a result, then he's handed over to that hardness of heart, isn't he?
Yeah.
And I think there is a danger within the church that we are hardening our hearts to these victims, and as a result, we will be hardened to victims in general.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sometimes I look at the church at large in the UK and I think, how can it be that so many Christians, so many pastors indeed, are so hard-hearted? You show them this stuff and it's like water off a duck's back. Nothing seems to connect. And yet we're talking about the most horrific act of violence and something that appalls God. And yet we are just kind of pretty blasé, really. And perhaps it is that. Perhaps it is the gradual deadening of the evangelical conscience, which starts with, well, hey, there's nothing to do with me, I wouldn't do it, but then it kind of blossoms as full-blown apathy. And I think apathy is one of the big things we're up against.
Yeah. I've heard it described as being apathy, sloth, this kind of neutrality. I've heard it described as being a sin that lives on because it has nothing it would die for. And I think that kind of sums up this going against the conscience. It's not willing to take a stand. It's not willing to die for what it believes. And therefore it just kind of lives on and perpetuates that same lack of love. So he's sat in the judge's seat. He is judging on this issue. He's going against his conscience. And then we see him release Barabbas and wash his hands. Now, in Matthew, it's actually the only account where he washes his hands. But can you explain what is washing the hands? What does that symbolize? It seems to be a bit of a strange ritual, maybe. So what's he doing there?
Well, I think he sort of explains it himself. He says, he washes his hands in front of the crowd. So it's a public display, it's a bit of drama. And it's worth noting, probably come back to this, the crowd is shouting all the louder, crucify him. And Pilate saw he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting. This is Matthew 27. So he's getting really worried about, is this going to be full-blown insurrection? And he's wanting to ultimately placate the crowd. And so what does he washes it, but he also wants to placate his own conscience and this kind of pretense of not being involved. So he washes his hands in front of the crowd and he says, I'm innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. And all the people answered, let his blood be on us and on our children. So it's about who's responsible. And so my hands are clean of this man's blood. It's nothing to do with me. again, self-deceit, because as he's gone down in history, Jesus suffered and died under Pontius Pilate. It very much is his responsibility. Now, of course, it's possible for there to be more than one person involved, and certainly the Jews were also responsible. And I think what you see in Scripture throughout is that kind of dual responsibility. You put him to death with the help of the Romans, said the apostles in the book of Acts. So, yes, these Jewish people also bear that responsibility. But in quite a unique way, Pilate did, because only he had that authority actually to hand him over to be crucified. So it's a fake cleansing. It's a sort of fake absolution of sins. And again, I think we are prone to that. We can do pretend repentance and get fake forgiveness, whether that's through religious rituals, or saying sorry, but we're not actually sorry, and we just do it all over again. So I think it's that danger of kind of cheap grace, or sort of the doling out of fake forgiveness. And for those who've followed this podcast a few weeks back, we looked at the He Gets Us advert, the Super Bowl advert, which is all about washing of feet. And didn't have the space in that instance to kind of go into any detail on Pilate's washing, but we did list that as one of the examples of the wrong kind of washing. That this is not a washing that actually cleanses.
Yeah.
It just it's like a whitewash.
Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting that Pilate washes his hands. He says, I'm not responsible. As we said, he is responsible. But we see that a lot in the church, don't we? Saying, hey, I'm not getting an abortion. I'm not the one who is doing this act. And yet, will we be held responsible? I read in my devotions this morning that God judges those who know more harshly than those who don't know. And so if we know, but we're not doing anything, what is that gonna... Where are we going to be put down in history?
Yeah.
Are we going to be responsible for this genocide that's taking place whilst we're washing our hands, saying we're not guilty of this? Yeah.
Yeah, it is that biblical principle, isn't it? And we've heard it said by others as well, like Wilberforce saying, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you didn't know. And that is the situation. I think there was maybe an extent to which in the 60s the church didn't know, or at least didn't know to the degree we know today, what abortion is, what the law would do. But now we do know, and yet we are standing really on the side of the perpetrators rather than on the side of the victims.
And then the final thing I want to talk about comes in the book of John. It's that question that Pilate's famous for. Jesus says, you say I am the king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is truth? Retorted Pilate. So we see Jesus says that those who speak out truthfully, those who are on the side of truth, those who are exposing things for what they really are, they're on his side, they listen to him. And Pilate responds with that question, what is truth? So in pro-life work, standing up for the vulnerable, those being killed in the womb, what is truth?
Yeah, I think this is where we see Pilate not only as a remarkably modern pro-choicer. He said, I wouldn't crucify Jesus, but hey, if that's what you want to do, it's up to you. I'm not going to stop you. He's not only pro-choice, he's also post-truth. And we think of us today living in a post-truth world, and I think we are, in that our culture is going that way increasingly. But in that sense, Pilate's remarkably modern. Or maybe we're just going back into pre-Christian times. Maybe we're just going back into that Roman Greek world of multiple gods and
moral relativism.
Yeah, and there just is no real objective universal truth. So perhaps that's just what happens when you kind of go back into post-Christendom's not the same as pre-Christendom, but the similarity. But yeah, I think that's sort of what is truth. Again, it feeds into this mentality where he just doesn't want to be involved. So it's a great excuse if you can say, well, no one really knows when life begins. Does the heart beat at 3 weeks? Well, or who knows when the baby begins to feel things. And it's a convenient ambiguity to say these things. And yet, of course, it's insanity. It's right against all the scientific evidence and what we've known for thousands of years, life begins at conception. But we do hear that, I think, a lot. And I think our culture is especially moving that direction of post-truth with, well, sex and gender are just a construct. And we're even hearing people on the street sometimes, aren't we, saying, look, even if it is a baby, I don't care. That's not what's important to me. What's important to me is it's got to be the woman's right to choose. So it's that lethal combination of moral negligence, neglect, dereliction really of duty, and the claim that there is no such thing as truth anyway, sort of covering both sides.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting, as you said, that he's very pro-choice. He's allowing the crowd to choose. He's asking what is truth, even though he's presented with the truth. Jesus says, doesn't he, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the truth is right before him, and yet he's saying, what is truth? And I think we see that on the streets when people are presented with the truth. They're very quick to say, what is truth? Yeah. Why does that matter? Again, very pro-choice. They want to choose for themselves whether someone lives or dies.
And we see it in the church as well. We so often, church leaders even will say, well, yes, I'm broadly pro-life, but, can we be sure where exactly life begins? Or, well, what about the hard cases? What about incest, life of the mother? What about rape or teenage pregnancy or fetal abnormality or whatever? And, I've said this a number of times, it bears repeating, that the leader of the FIEC, the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, one of the largest gatherings of evangelical churches in the UK, on his blog said, well, look, most of our churches will be broadly pro-life, but we'll be less sure when it comes to instances of rape, incest, teenage pregnancy, so on. And instead of seeing that as a really urgent sort of crisis of moral, theological, spiritual confusion and chaos and heresy even, he describes those as nuances for people like me to wrestle with. That's just like, okay, that comes to the territory of your field of work because you're a pro-life activist. So, here's something on your desk. There are nuances. These aren't nuances. These are babies being killed for what? The crime of their parents being related, or their mothers younger than the arbitrary age at which we think it's suddenly acceptable to have a baby. This is child sacrifice, and yet people like John Stevens are hiding behind what is truth. Well, who knows the answer to these things? There's no heart to get to the bottom of those questions to actually find out. It's not an honest. You can ask that question honestly, can't you? What is truth? Tell me the truth.
Yeah.
But what Pilate's actually doing is suggesting there's no such thing as truth, or I'm not interested in being pinned down by the objective truth. And that's all over the church today.
Yeah, and for Pilate, it seems that he's very motivated by the crowd, which I think is a key motivation for the church and people in general who might be neutral on this issue. They're motivated by the mob rule, either to remain neutral rather than to declare that they are pro-life, or to wash their hands of it, as it were. So Pilate is very motivated by what the crowd is saying, and I know you and Tim have been doing this podcast on church leaders and objections, and that was one of them, wasn't it? About the people in the congregation don't want this, or they'll be offended, and we see here when the leader is led by the flock, things go terribly wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may permit myself to pop out of our normal remit and make some comments on ecclesiology, I do think that there are grave dangers with the sort of church by democracy model, which is all over. Many churches, in one form or another, are not only informally led by the flock, basically majority opinion or the whoever shouts the loudest. Some are formally led by the flock in that everything is voted for, and it's by majority votes.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid I think it's totally unbiblical. But also I think it is demonstrably very dangerous because mob rule doesn't tend to be on the side of what's righteous and true, and it's a very unstable way of making decisions, because what typically happens is the loudest people speak up, and the rest are kind of cowed into submission, and that's exactly what we see here. Pilate sees this crowd getting more and more sort of amped up, and he thinks, okay, I've got to just put an end to this. And that's when they're not formally in charge. But in a church where essentially the members are formally in charge, I think it's a really dangerous thing. I read an article recently about the problem of not having enough pastors actually going into the ministry, and the comment was made, when churches treat their pastors like hirelings, they think they are the ones who dictate, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. To which my response is, well, in a legal sense, they are hirelings, and maybe that's what you need to look into, because actually, if it's only by consent that a pastor or an elder is appointed, and only by consent that he continues to be allowed to do anything, well, who's really in charge there?
Yeah.
So I do think it's important how we. But I'd say even in church, that's not formally the case. So in so many situations, some pastors say this to me, it's very much what will people think.
Yes.
It's the Pilate mentality of what will the crowd do to me if I make a stand on this.
And you see that not just in churches, but with individuals as well. I'm privately pro-life, but I'm not going to say that out loud because I might lose friends. I might lose relationships with family members. It's that there is almost a cowardice about it, knowing what's right, but not being willing to stand up for what's right. Yeah.
And when you hear people say stuff like, "Oh, I wish I had your courage to do what you do," it's a bit like when people say to my wife, "Oh, I wouldn't have the patience to home educate," and she's saying, "I don't have the patience to home educate." God grows patience in you, and you just do as well. And the same is true really of courage. It's not an optional extra. It's not like a hair colour. It's not something you're born with. It's actually, I think we've really relegated courage to this kind of, it's like on the kind of optional side of things, but it's not. It isn't it in Revelation 21 that it's the cowards along with the others who are judged.
Yeah, who are cast out.
And that's pretty severe. So I think we've slightly sought to rebrand courage as one of those optional extras, and we need to repent of that, because as I think C.S. Lewis said, courage is actually the form of every other virtue at its highest, because actually without courage you'll never love faithfully to the end, you'll never be generous, you'll never be kind, you'll never, whatever it is, if it only goes to the point where it doesn't cost you, in particular, the approval or the acceptance of others, if there's no courage to kind of finish off the job, then really, what does it count for?
Yeah. Yes, and I think this Easter, I think this should be a particular challenge to us. As we're now in Holy Week, coming up to Good Friday and Easter Sunday, what are our areas of neutrality where God is challenging us to stand up, and yet we're failing, we're washing our hands of any responsibility? And I think it's a good thing for us to reflect on, particularly with this issue of abortion, where so many people like to remain neutral. They like to say, well, it's not got anything to do with me, I'm not the one having an abortion. I'm not the one encouraging women to have an abortion. It's up to them to choose, and allowing the mob mentality to rule. I think this serves as a warning and as something that we need to examine ourselves as we come to this season. But just to close, I wanted to highlight the crowd's words when they say, "His blood be on us and on our children." And just want to highlight actually the hope that is, because we do want Christ's blood to be on us and on our children. And even in this area where maybe we have washed our hands, maybe we have absolved ourselves of the responsibility that we are guilty of by being a bystander and allowing this injustice to continue, that Christ's blood does cover even that. So yeah, I think this is a fantastic passage to be reflecting on, to be examining ourselves, and to be coming before Christ this season in repentance and receiving his forgiveness, but then going on to follow him, to take up our cross, whatever that might mean that we need to do in this area, taking up our cross to follow him. Do you have any final thoughts, Dave?
No, I think that's it. I think at Christmas and at Easter, there are these unique opportunities to reflect on Christ, his birth, his death and resurrection. And at Christmas time on this channel, sometimes we've said, well, look, don't celebrate Christmas whilst showing utter contempt for unborn babies in the womb. Mm-hmm. And neutrality is contempt. Mm. So at Christmas time, let's not celebrate the season, so-called, and yet by our actions prove ourselves to be really very much against the spirit of Christmas, very much against the treasuring of human life, the celebration of it, and that gospel faithfulness to God's ways. And same this time of year. I think let's not say we're celebrating the season. Let's not wash our hands by going to church if we're not actually serious about, yes, receiving the Lord's forgiveness, but also walking in his ways, showing our allegiance to the Lord Jesus, by being those disciples who stood at the foot of the cross rather than running away, who identify themselves with the suffering servant. And in our day, it's not the only, but it's one of the key ways in which we have opportunities to do that, is how we respond to the unborn child. Will we take up the sufferings of Christ, step out of neutrality, and be on their side? And we've touched on Bonhoeffer a bit. We've been kind of tiptoeing around him, but he said this: only he who cries out for the Jews may sing Gregorian chants, which is to say, don't go and play at church and sing your hymns if you won't also stand faithfully on that point of the battlefield where the battle is raging. If you won't say out loud, if you won't suffer and die for the claim that Jews are made in God's image, and Jewish Christians can hold office in the church or whatever, don't play at religion. And I think that's the challenge. This Easter, let's not play at religion. Let's not wash our hands in front of the crowd for a show. Let's not say, hey, this has nothing to do with us. Let's make a stand and be counted, because of course the Lord Jesus didn't stay neutral for us, did he? He went all the way to the cross, through the grave and out again, for us and for our sakes. And so as we remember that, let's embrace it fully, not just taking it halfway.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dave.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening. If you're listening, thank you for watching if you're watching. And we wish you a happy Easter, and we challenge you to take up your cross, to stand, not be neutral, and follow Jesus.